with a screen share. We want you to have a look at the topic, which is the history of medicine and the alternate systems of medicine. I request Professor Alok to make the first presentation.
Good morning. So we'll begin the talk today. That is about the history of medicine. Medicine, all of us know as a science. So why so much fuss about the medicine? Because if you know the medicine, if you know the history of the medicine, then you realize how the progress has happened, how far we have come, and how we have developed ourselves. So in the history of medicine, we will start with the history of medicine from the ancient times. Medicine is probably as old as the humanity, as the human culture itself. We have seen things in the beginning when we saw something which caused sickness. Our ancestors recorded it. When we found a potential cure, we documented it. Our ancestors slowly kept on compiling all the things which they thought caused sickness or they thought can treat sickness. So these were the observations which were recorded, but there was no science in it. It was like technology. In the beginning, we had technology, but we never understood how it worked. Same was true for the medicine. In the beginning, we had some knowledge, but we never knew how it worked. Later on, slowly, as the science developed, we started learning how things work, how we become sick, and how we are able to treat ourselves, or what other help we can take to treat our conditions. The oldest recorded physician is probably from Egypt, 3000 years before Christ. And the oldest documented books of medicine or the records of sickness and their potential treatment are from ancient Egypt, which are around 2000 to 1500 years before Christian era. So these were the papyrus, the method of documentation at that time. Before paper, we had papyrus. So one was on gynecological illness, one was on surgical problems, and one was on the medical problems. So these were the three oldest recorded things. After that, the next records that we have are from the Greek time, from Greco-Roman time. And the physicians and the surgeons at the time were Galen, who was a surgeon. And there was a physician, Hippocrates. Hippocrates' name is even today known because Hippocrates laid down the ethics for practice of medicine, how we should practice medicine. Our purpose should be to try to benefit the patient and make sure that no harm comes to the patient. Hippocratic oath is something which he laid down in the around 2000 years ago, and that is still followed today. So that was the time when the evolution started in our understanding and how we should be, how the physicians should, or the doctors in general should behave with the patient. Slowly the history progressed, and the progress of history was marked with observations which were added. And then later on, we started understanding things. So for quite some time, the history of medicine also has not continuously improved. The science has not improved continuously. There were periods when there was some rapid growth, and after that, there was a period in which there was no growth at all. So after the Greco-Roman time, after that, the progress again started sometime around 1500 after the Christ. And that was the time when the growth has started. That was the period when the scientists, the doctors, and the public in general started questioning the old established teaching. In our library, we had a quotation by Sir C.V. Raman that the great advances in our understanding have come by challenging the old established understanding. So once the humanity started challenging the old understanding, we started progressing and we improved our understanding of the medicine, and the history progressed. There were multiple episodes of very bad illnesses during the history of medicine. There was something called Black Death, which was plague. It affected Europe sometime around 1400 to 14th to 15th century. After that, there was another big epidemic which hit the Europe, almost whole of the world. That was in the year 1918 to 1919. That was called Spanish flu. After that, we had multiple small epidemics, and unfortunately, we are still in the middle of a pandemic, which is called COVID-19 pandemic. So that much I can tell about the history. Something more about the history and the science we will keep on talking as we go through the presentation. What we are going to tell today, what we are going to take through today is not the whole history of medicine. It is not possible to cover the whole history of medicine of 5,000 years in a period of 1 hour. What will give you some interesting snippets, some snapshot where we found something which was so interesting that we thought it is worth mentioning. These are the instances which are interesting to us. We will give you some names, some scientists who are given credit for the discovery. It doesn't mean that the other people did not work or nobody else contributed to these discoveries. But what we are telling is a few documented instances. So we'll on, please.
I once again request everyone to please mute your microphones. Simple instruction. Please mute your microphones. As Professor Alok has elegantly captured the timeline of the historic progression in medicine, since time immemorial till the present day, from the Black Death in Europe in the mid 1400s to 1500, through the Spanish flu pandemic, 1918, to the latest COVID-19 pandemic, the current major disaster we are all facing world over. This is history. Why should we learn from history? Why should we study history? Because, to quote Carl Sagan, mathematician, physicist, astronomer from the Cornell University, they saw for us what we see for them. We see beyond them because we stand on the shoulders. There is an adage in Telugu which says, Charitralo nunchi nerchukoni varu charitraheenulavataru. If you do not learn from history, you will not have a history. So we try to always reminisce, recapitulate the great deeds of our ancestors in medicine and their legacy, which we are carrying forwards. Okay, so one aspect as we trace the history of medicine, which as doctors in training and researchers in training you people are, what you should remember is always remember the progress of medicine to what we are seeing today occurred only when the observations were made meticulously and the explanations were attempted to explain the observations. In other words, an attempt was made for explaining the facts with theory. This is the way of research. First, you observe, and after observing, you try to explain the phenomena which you have observed with the then currently available logic of science, reasoning, and the laws of nature. Science progressed from the era of fitting facts to theories to the era of fitting theories to explain the facts. Please mark my words, listen carefully. You have to observe, not simply see. You have to carefully listen, not simply hear. You have to study, not simply read. Reading is what you do with a newspaper on a toilet commode. Studying is what you do for life. So the we progress by meticulously observing, and we progress by carefully recording, we progress by analytically reasoning. So with this preamble, with this introduction, we move ahead with some of the snapshots of history of medicine. Okay.
What happened?
We first considered the case of Andrea Vesali. This gentleman first thought of identifying, defining, and documenting the structure of the human body. During the 1500s, the period of Vesalius, dead bodies were buried in cemeteries. Vesalius, he developed a passion for documenting the human structure by doing what is called the cadaveric dissection. As a part of your coursework in anatomy, the first subject which you will be studying along with biochemistry and physiology, cadavers and their dissection will form the basis for understanding the structure of the human body. At a time when it was considered not pleasing or in fact a taboo, Vesalius dug up, procured, obtained cadavers. Cadaver is a dead body. And he meticulously dissected it layer by layer to document the skin, the muscles, the arteries, the veins, the nerves, the bones, their origins, their insertions, their three-dimensional structure, and so on. Because of the immense efforts put in by Andrea Vesalius, it was possible for us to have an insight grossly into what a human body looked like. What a man looked like, what a woman looked like when you peel off the skin, what is inside. Okay, so this led to the path of defining the structure of the human body and thereby laid the path for the understanding of the human function. Later on, microscopy, which was introduced in the time of Leeuwenhoek, and several leading pathologists, histologists, anatomists, they contributed to the microanatomy. Vesalius had contributed to the macroanatomy, our understanding of the gross structure of the human body. Later on, this led to the path towards understanding the function of the human body. Much later, in the 70s and 80s, electron microscopy came in. We started understanding the miniature molecular structure of the human body as well. So this is the first historic moment we thought you should be knowing, because you will be going to an anatomy theater where the cadavers are kept to understand the human structure. We were fortunate as students to have actually carried out the dissection, but you will be demonstrated the dissection. Maybe you can try out dissecting if there is time and place. I request Professor Alok to brief about Edward Jenner.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Mohan. So now we come to the next great scientist, Dr. Edward Jenner. Dr. Edward Jenner was a physician who was practicing in France, and there was one disease which was very common at that time and often led to loss of life and prolonged sickness. The disease was called smallpox. So Dr. Edward Jenner used to see a lot of patients with the smallpox, and nobody knew what is the cause of this disease. Smallpox, what causes it and how to treat it. So Dr. Edward Jenner noticed one thing, that the people who worked with cows, the cow herds, milkmaids, dairy people, these were the people who are not getting the smallpox. One day he was fortunate enough to hear somebody, as Dr. Mohan had said, that we often see, but we don't observe. We hear, but we don't note. So Dr. Edward Jenner noted one thing. He noticed one milkmaid talking to the other and telling that she will never get smallpox because she has had cowpox. That sparked an idea in his mind. It started a chain of thought, and he thought that maybe he understands what causes a smallpox and how to treat it. So he did not have much understanding at that time. What people knew about smallpox at that time was that this is a disease which comes with fever and multiple blisters on the body. And if you come in touch with a person, if you come in contact with a person who already has a smallpox, you are also likely to get a smallpox. So what Dr. Jenner did, he found a patient who had cowpox. He got the fluid from the blister of the person who had smallpox and inoculated that fluid, injected that fluid into a child, 8 years old child. That child got sickness. He became mildly sick. He had little bit of fever, but not much, few blisters and little bit of fever. After that, he recovered. Then Dr. Jenner did the next experiment. After a few days, he got a patient with smallpox. He took the fluid from the blisters of the patient with a smallpox and inoculated it into the same child. Normally, the understanding was that if you take the fluid from the blister of a smallpox and inject it into a healthy person, that person will develop a smallpox. But what Dr. Edward Jenner saw at that time was that the child who had previously developed cowpox did not develop smallpox. So Dr. Edward Jenner realized that he had found a way to treat smallpox, or rather to prevent smallpox from happening. All of us should understand that this happened a long time before any of the understanding about the cause of the smallpox or even major diseases was known. So Dr. Edward Jenner's discovery was wonderful. He started treating the patients, lot of people, and they started inoculating them and to prevent development of smallpox. And this experiment was so successful that in the France, at that time, he was invited to inoculate the whole army which was going to the war. Dr. Edward Jenner became very powerful, and his scientific contribution was so much that humans realized that a disease called smallpox could be actually prevented. Incidentally, smallpox became the first disease in the history of humanity which was eradicated from the face of the earth because of the human efforts. All thanks to Dr. Edward Jenner. Thank you. Dr. Mohan, please.
This is a momentous event of the person going on from the era of non-specific remedies to a focused way to treat. I would like to pick up, as a clinician, I'm very much tempted to quote the story of René Laennec, René Théophile Laennec, who is the inventor of what you see as a very commonly used apparatus. I'm sure many of you would be seeing this. You would be seeing this. I'm sure you would recognize it. Every doctor will be wearing this like this, and maybe you will also like to wear it probably like this. Okay. This instrument came into vogue during the time of Laennec. Laennec, he observed that in that era, the doctor would put the ear to the chest like this directly and try to listen to the heart or to the lungs. And later on, this was inconvenient for both the patient and the doctor, but there was no other go. And what Laennec did, he took a stiff piece of paper, he rolled it into a tube, and he put this on his ear and applied it to the chest. This was the first step where anyone used the laws of physics to capture the live sounds occurring in the human body for the purposes of understanding the function. Vesalius, he had dissected corpses, dead bodies, cadavers to understand the structure. Jenner took the initial steps towards a meaningful treatment, preventive or otherwise, of a disease. And here we have Laennec, who actually started understanding the function of the human body, listening to the heart sounds, listening to the lung sounds as they happened live. So slowly, technology started entering into the field of medicine. There is another gentleman who goes by the name Aumbreger, Leopold von Aumbreger. Aumbreger was the son of a wine merchant. He was a very playful, mischievous guy. All the time he wanted to run away from the house and play. His father wanted to keep him busy. They had huge wooden barrels of wine in their cellar. Cellar ante bhugruham. Wine is prepared from grapes and it is stored in wooden barrels. Wooden barrels ante Telugu తెలిసిన వాళ్ళకి పీపాయిలు. They are kept in wooden barrels and allowed to age, ferment with age. Older the wine, more exquisite is the taste and more expensive the wine is. So there were about several dozens of barrels. The barrel is taller than a standing adult man. The height of the barrel is more than 6 feet. For Aumbreger, who was a teenager, his father asked him to check what is the level of the wine in each of the barrel. So for example, if you think this is the barrel, up to what level? Is it up to here, up to here, up to what level the barrel is full? So when the size of the barrel is taller than a tall man who is standing, how will you look inside? You need a ladder. You take a ladder, you put the ladder against the barrel, you climb upon that, remove the lid, and then look inside. The whole process would take a lot of time. Aumbreger's dad felt by keeping this guy doing this work, whole afternoon instead of going out and playing in the sun, Aumbreger would instead do this work and be in the shade. But Aumbreger was a very smart guy. What he started doing, he started tapping on the side of the barrel from below upwards. At some point he discovered when the interface between the wine and the air, there would be air on the top of the wine in the barrel. When you reach that interface, the sound would change. So when you tap on a full barrel, the sound would be a little muffled, but as you cross the upper level, the sound would suddenly become resonant, like beating on a drum. He smartly recognized the change in the sound, took a chalk piece, and at the point where the change occurred, he marked a horizontal level. So within no time, what his father thought will keep him occupied for 4 or 5 hours, he finished in half hour. His dad got rattled. How can you do that? And he started verifying. It was so precise, so perfect. Aumbreger's marking the barrels regarding the upper level of the fluid. It was absolutely precise mathematically, and this was extended later on in the early 1900s by William Osler in the United States as the phenomenon of percussion. Tomorrow, when you are visiting the wards, examining the patients, you will be taking the history, patient's history. How old is he? What occupation he does? Where is he from? How long he is unwell? What are the complaints? That is the history. You take the present history, past history, personal history, family history, and so on. Then you examine the patient. Examining the patient will involve observing inspection, feeling palpation, percussing, the story of Omberger, which we learned now, and we will also be using this for hearing, listening. This is auscultation. So slowly, from the era where you were observing grossly, where you were trying to treat in a focused way, you slowly moved, introducing technology, the era of the stethoscope, and also using the faculties of observation for recording the phenomena that occur in the human body. The era of physical examination came into vogue. Professor Alok.
Thank you, Dr. Mohan. So now we go to the next great personality in the history of medicine. Now his story is a little bit tragic. His name was Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis. Sometime around 1800 and between 1840 and 1850, he contributed so strongly to the medicine that even today we feel the significance of the contribution. Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis was trained in Italy, and he was an obstetrician. He was working in Italy in Padua in a big hospital. And he was at that time, he was working in a what today will be called a maternity hospital, a hospital where women came for childbirth, pregnant women came for childbirth. So Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis was holding post of significance in a group of hospitals. There were actually two divisions of the hospital. One division of the hospital was a teaching hospital for doctors. So they had doctors, they had medical students working in that hospital who are helping conduct deliveries and childbirth. The second division of the hospital which was run by the midwives. Now, for those of you who will understand the term midwives, for those who don't understand the term midwives are women who have less education, but they have some skill in delivering, in helping women deliver the babies in childbirth. So there were two separate divisions of the hospital. One was run by the doctor, second was run by the midwives. So Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis noticed something very interesting in between these two hospitals. The mortality in the hospital, or the death rate among the women who were admitted to the hospital for childbirth in the hospital which was run by the midwives was somewhere around 2%, means 2 out of 100 women who got admitted to that hospital died. That was pretty standard kind of death rate at that time. And the cause of death at the time was fever. Pregnant women would get admitted, they will deliver a baby, then they will develop fever, and many of them would die. So that was around 2% was the death rate in the hospital, which was run by the midwives. But there was other hospital which was used for training of the doctors, and in that hospital the death rate was 10%. 10 out of every 100 women who got admitted in that site died. And this difference was noticed by the people of the city. When pregnant women came for admission to the hospital, they actually requested to be admitted to the hospital which was run by the midwives. So Dr. Semmelweis was looking at it. What was the reason? Why should doctors who are more educated but have poor outcome? More women are dying on that side. He started looking at the reasons. First, he thought that it is probably overcrowding. But then he realized that because more and more women are requesting admission to be in the hospital run by the midwives. The hospital which is run by the midwives were more crowded, but they had less death rate. The other side, the hospital which was run by the doctors had less crowd, but more death rate was there. And then one day, one unfortunate incident happened. They had, for teaching of the doctors, they had an area where dissections were going on in that hospital. In that area, one of his colleagues got pricked by a scalpel which was being used for cadaveric dissection, and his colleague fell sick and died. So when Dr. Semmelweis found the autopsy of his friend, that was the what we simply say post-mortem examination, he found that the features of in the dead body of his friend were almost similar to the features which were seen among the women, pregnant women who died because of the fever. So that started a chain of thought, and Dr. Semmelweis, till that time, there was no understanding about the cause of the sicknesses. So Dr. Semmelweis thought that there is a substance which comes from the dead body and can make a person sick and kill a person. So that is how he thought that this is some kind of obnoxious substance, some problem. He also noticed that when doctors came back after the dissection from the cadavers and they went for delivery among the pregnant women's ward, many of them had smelly hands. But he noticed that some of the doctors who washed their hands carefully with chlorinated lime, their hands did not smell bad and their hands smelled clean. So he reasoned that washing hands with chlorinated lime is able to take out some cadaveric substances from the hands, can keep the hands clean. So Dr. Semmelweis tried an experiment and he made doctors wash their hands with chlorinated lime before going out of the dissection hall. And to his surprise, the death rate in the area, the hospital which was run by the doctors, came down and became equal to the hospital that was run by the midwives. So that's how Dr. Semmelweis realized it. He published his findings, but many doctors were unhappy with the way he was trying to push doctors to make frequent hand wash. He actually said that doctors are many times be unnecessarily, unwantedly, unintentionally, we are responsible for the death of our patient. So that was his observation. Many doctors were unhappy, and this controversy became so bad that Ignaz Semmelweis' career was over. But the contribution to science of hand washing, which Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis started, is continuing today. And in COVID-19 pandemic, even population has learned the significance of frequent hand washing. Dr. Mohan, sir.
That's absolutely true, sir. We are still propagating what Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis had described almost 200 years ago. And we still, in spite of vaccination becoming available tentatively for COVID-19, we still follow the disinfection principle of wiping the hands and keeping the hands clean by using an antiseptic. So some legacies in the history of medicine, they almost last forever. The Jenner's concept of vaccination has started, but Semmelweis' contribution with regard to hand disinfection has also come here to stay. It might interest you today in 2021, not only in operating theaters, not only in labor rooms, even in my medical intensive care unit, the only variable which predicts a good outcome is the doctors keeping their hands clean. Nothing beats hand hygiene. Following hand hygiene brings down death rates in every way of life in medical profession. That way, the contribution of Semmelweis is seminal and historical. Louis Pasteur is well known to many of you in school and college. You would have read about the pasteurization of milk, the friendly neighborhood milk packets which you purchase is pasteurized milk. Milk was pasteurized to prevent the transmission of infection through milk. Pasteur has several contributions to his credit. The one which is well remembered is his contribution towards rabies vaccination. That was the pre-exposure prophylaxis and post-exposure prophylaxis particularly. I'm sorry, it is post-exposure prophylaxis, and the way he carried out his interventions historically in the immunization. We remember him in terms of the Pasteur Institute at Paris. Louis Pasteur, a giant among people of his era. The era of Louis Pasteur was soon followed by the era of Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen, the discoverer of X-rays, who serendipitously discovered that the presence of X-rays, and that enabled the visualization of the interior of the human body, not by removing the skin as you would do on an operating table or on a dissecting table with a cadaver, but in a live, walking, talking person like you and me. Röntgen, 1896, ushered in the era of X-rays, with which we were able to see what was happening inside the human body in a live, walking, talking person. The other major development that occurred during this period was the technology modified to record the cardiac events in the form of a graph, which is called the electrocardiogram. This was the contribution by a gentleman called Einthoven. I request Professor Alok to continue with the saga of history, a very interesting story about Werner Forssmann.
Thank you, Dr. Mohan. So now we come to the next step. I'm going to talk about a gentleman called Werner Forssmann. Werner Forssmann was a physician in the beginning. He was training in research in Germany. So Dr. Werner Forssmann understood that there was a lot was understood about the heart. And Dr. Mohan has already told the contribution of given contributions made to the medicine by discovery of ECG or electrocardiograph as well as the X-ray. Now Dr. Werner Forssmann realized, and a lot of physicians at the time knew, that they understand a little bit about the working of the heart, but they still don't understand everything about the working of the heart. How hard does the heart work? How much blood does heart pump in 1 minute or in one beat? It is possible to calculate the number of heartbeats. With ECG, it became possible to see how the nerve conduction is happening or the electrical conduction is happening inside the heart. But it was still not possible to realize how much blood is going. It became possible to see the blood pressure in the arm, but it was not known how much is the pressure inside the heart. So all these were things which were still plaguing the physicians at the time, and everybody was curious about it. Now, many experiments were done among the animals. So Dr. Mohan has already told about Andre Vesalius. So that is how when we started dissecting humans, we learned about the human anatomy. But we have done the dissections on humans which are dead. And dissections on the live animal or live human were not done. And it was not possible to see how a beating heart works. So later on, people started doing experiments on beating heart among the animals. The animals were sacrificed, beating heart was seen, and it was realized that how much blood can heart pump in 1 minute. It became known among the animals, but it was still not known among the humans. Then another experiment was done among the animals, that a hollow tube was passed from the veins into the heart, to the right side of the heart, or from the artery to the left side of the heart, to measure the pressure in both the chambers differently. And it was seen that the pressure difference is very high among the animals. But what is the pressure in the humans? How much is the pressure? And how does the human heart work? All this information was not known. This hollow tube which was passed was called a catheter. So the catheterization was done among the animals, but not for the humans. It was nobody had ever attempted it. So what Dr. Werner Forssmann thought, that it might be possible to do a catheterization for the humans also. At that time, the X-rays were already there, and it became known that there are certain chemicals if you inject in the human body, X-ray cannot penetrate it. So when you take a X-ray, you can see the bones. You cannot see the flesh, but you can see the bone. If you do the X-ray, if you inject a chemical called contrast medium, contrast is something which X-ray cannot penetrate. So you can see wherever the contrast goes, and the X-ray will show in which area that chemical is going. So what Dr. Werner Forsman and what a lot of other people realize, that if you find a way of injecting contrast inside the heart, you will know a lot about working of the heart. But nobody had ever done catheterization of a living human heart. So what Dr. Werner Forsman thought, let me try it. Now that was both a very daring experiment as well as a very stupid experiment. If you pass a tube into your heart, in your beating heart, and if the tube injures the heart, what will happen? Only God can predict. Everything can go wrong. But what Dr. Werner Forsman did was he passed a tube into his own heart. He passed a catheter into his own heart from the elbow. It reached up to the heart, and he took the X-rays of that image to prove that the catheter was inside his own beating heart. He did that experiment. That experiment was reported in the newspaper, but unfortunately for him, his seniors and the administrators of the hospital were very unhappy with him. Everybody was worried that what could have gone wrong, and he could have died during the experiment. Dr. Werner Forsman was told not to repeat this kind of acts in future, and he got so much unhappy that he changed the field. He became a surgeon and became a urologist. But at the same time, when he had done the experiment, another team was working in the United States on the same idea. So there was a team called a team of Dr. Cournand, Dr. Dickinson, and Dr. Werner Forsman, who got the Nobel Prize for this experiment in 1956. This condition is called the catheterization of the heart, coronary angiography. It is today the branch of cardiology. It exists mainly because of this contribution. It is not possible to imagine cardiology without contributions of cardiac catheterization. Thanks to Dr. Forsman, Dr. Cournand, and Dr. Dickinson. At the same time, it is also not possible to imagine a cardiologist who will catheterize his own heart.
Very well said, sir. Professor Alok, I think it exemplifies the spirit, adventurous spirit of Werner Forsman. We move ahead with our foray into the current history of medicine with the story of Stanley Prusiner. You, as students, would have read about microorganisms. Microorganisms can be bacteria, they can be fungi, they can be protozoa. They can also be viruses. But then there were particles. Well, some think they are living, some don't, which have been implicated in the causation of certain diseases with fancy names. Like, for example, Creutzfeldt-Jakob syndrome. A syndrome is nothing but a collection of symptoms and signs. Symptom is what the patient tells you. Oh, this class is boring. There's a symptom. If you all feel and you express that, oh, this class is boring, it's a symptom. When we examine, we find that you have put your speakers off and you are not actually listening to the class. We know that what you find as boring is because you have not listened to the class, or perhaps you only heard the class. That is a sign. You'll be dealing with a lot of this in your course. A collection of symptoms and signs together constitute a syndrome. So the etiological cause, though the disease was described 100 years ago, no one really knew what was causing this Creutzfeldt-Jakob syndrome. The work of Prusiner demonstrated that the set of organisms which are in the twilight zone between living and the dead, they're not entirely living, they're not entirely dead. They are called proteinaceous infectious particles, or the prions, P-R-I-O-N-S. So the prion etiological basis of diagnosis of disease was demonstrated first time around by Prusiner. Later on, in the year of grace 1997, Prusiner was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine for this path-breaking, outstanding work. Robert Koch demonstrated the organism that causes TB, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. He established the Koch's postulates that say that, yeah, this is the bug that causes this disease. You will be reading about Koch's postulates when you go on to your second year microbiology, to say that this plasmodium causes malaria. It has to satisfy certain conditions. So the principle linking a bug or a microorganism to the causation of a disease was postulated by Robert Koch. Then we came to the era of bacteriology, mycobacteriology, mycology, study of fungi, then virology, and then came these bizarre new organisms called prions. You will be intrigued by the word prions, and I think for you, the world is in your palm, in your mobile. So I'm dead sure many of you would be right now Googling what is a prion, Karatala amalakam. Okay, so this kind of technology interface with medicine led to betterment of our understanding of the human body and our understanding of how it functions and how diseases occur. I pass on the baton to Professor Alok for his next nugget of knowledge.
So thank you, Dr. Mohan. Now we come to the next person, and this was this is Dr. Barry Marshall. He is still alive. So Dr. Barry Marshall was a research student in Australia who was working under an expert who was working in the field of peptic ulcer. Now, peptic ulcer or gastric ulcer is a disease which in layman's understanding was caused by hurry, worry, and curry, spicy food. You are always under stress, tension, and you are always thinking so much. In the medical understanding, the cause of the ulcer disease was because of the lot of stress we take, smoking, and something which comes genetically to us. Somebody in the family, the tendency to develop peptic ulcer or the gastric ulcer passes. So the treatment of gastric ulcer was something which you have to take a lot of antacid. Antacids are chemicals which are which have the capability to neutralize the acid. Now this acid can cause ulcers inside the stomach, inside the duodenum, and it is basically a very painful condition. So the treatment are, you have to take so much, somebody who has a gastric ulcer disease has to take so much of gastric acid, that will be the antacid, that will be, the requirement will be almost like 10 liters per month, huge amount. And it was very big thing for the pharmaceutical industry. And then came a miracle drug, which was called histamine receptor blocker, the histamine type 2 receptor blocker. So the first drug was cimetidine, then came a drug called ranitidine. These were the drugs which, if you take it, they reduce the acid secretion from the stomach. So you don't have to take a lot of chemicals. And with that, the symptoms subsided. But these symptoms will remain subsided only as long as you take the drug. Once you stop it, it's over. The symptom will come back. When the gastric ulcer or the acid peptic disease comes, it causes a lot of pain in your chest and the abdomen. Patients used to suffer a lot. So at that time, there was a gastroenterologist in Australia who was working on it. And there was a new theory that said that it might be because of a bacteria. Now, there was a lot of people who were working, and his mentor of Dr. Barry Marshall, Robin Warren, was working over that, and he was trying to find out whether bacteria can cause peptic ulcer. So when they tried to find it, they found that the bacteria was found near the ulcer. But everybody said that bacteria is just because a person is present near the scene of crime doesn't mean that that person is a criminal. It just might be what is legally known, or by the police say, as an innocent bystander. So that is what all the journals said, That is what all the other scientists said, that this bacteria, which is today known as Helicobacter pylori, is just an innocent bystander for the gastric ulcer. It is not a cause of the gastric ulcer. So while this discussion was going on, and it was not possible to prove the mechanism that this bacteria, this Helicobacter pylori, really causes gastric ulcer. At that time, Dr. Barry Marshall did an experiment which was probably as daring and as foolhardy as was the experiment of Dr. Werner Forsman. He decided to experiment on himself. So what he did was, first he got endoscopy done. Now endoscope is a tube, a flexible tube which can be passed inside the body cavity, and there is, at the tip there is a lens from which you can see inside the body. So he got endoscopy done. A tube was passed down his esophagus and into his stomach, and the photographs were taken of his healthy stomach. Then that endoscopy tube was pulled out. After that, he drank a culture of Helicobacter pylori. That is really, I consider that a very, very terrifying idea, because you don't know what a whole load of bacteria will do to you inside. So he drank a whole culture of the bacteria. And after that, after taking within 1 week, he started feeling pain and tightness in his chest and symptoms of ulcers. He got the endoscopy done again. And this time when the endoscopy was done, he found that the inside of his stomach is the big bag down at the end of your esophagus, where all the food goes once we eat it. So he found that the whole area of the stomach, the whole lining, what we call mucosa of the stomach, was red, and there were small patches of ulcer-like activity in there. So once those photographs were there, it was finally proven that because of the culture, what Dr. Mohan told you about Robert Koch, the Koch's postulate was getting fulfilled. That once you have the bacteria, once you take the bacteria, it is possible to cause the sickness. So the Koch's postulate was fulfilled, and finally the medical fraternity accepted that yes, it is possible that bacteria is the cause of gastric ulcer. Now this bacteria causes not only gastric ulcer, it causes inflammation of the stomach, or what is called gastritis, and later on it can often lead to cancers of the stomach also. That was a very big understanding that a disease which we thought is just because of our lifestyle or the way we live and work was actually the result of an infection. Now, Dr. Mohan.
So, having considered the certain snapshots from the history, it is necessary to wrap up today's session with a brief overview regarding the alternate systems of medicine. What you are getting trained is under what is called as modern medicine, but it is actually allopathy. The other systems, alternate systems of medicine, do exist. These are several. In India, we have the Ayurveda system of medicine, the Unani system of medicine, Siddha medicine, homeopathy, and several naturopathy and others. They have Chinese system of traditional medicine, and in the African tribes, there are their own native medicine. Where knowledge is scanty, theories are plenty. It is to be understood. You may be knowing, for example, there are several near and dear of yours, relatives of yours, who passionately practice the alternative systems of medicine, especially for chronic diseases. I know several families who take only and only homeopathy and nothing else. I know several families who take only Ayurvedic treatment. So what you need to know is there is nothing called one system of medicine. How many of you like only idlis? Some of you may like puri. The other may like poha. The other may like dosa. Similarly, what the patient chooses to follow as a preventive, promotive, or curative medical treatment is the patient's choice. As practitioners of allopathy, it is your responsibility to treat them with dignity, accept them with all the incompleteness according to your perception, and you respect their value and sentiment. You are treating a person. You are not treating a disease. You are treating a human being with a disease. It's not that you are treating high blood pressure, you are not treating high blood sugar, but you are treating a person with a name and a life and an existence who is afflicted with and who is suffering from such a disease. Please remember human dignity. Do not badmouth, do not put down, do not have a contemptuous, conciliatory attitude towards alternative systems of medicine. You don't believe in it, that's your problem. Patient believes in it, that's the patient's problem. You try to practice the art and science of medicine you are trained in, the modern medicine, and try to benefit the suffering, reduce the suffering of a person with a disease. I request Professor Alok to say some very salient points regarding the alternate systems of medicine.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Mohan. So we are here regarding some alternate systems. Basically, when the medicine is started, it is started with a set of observations, and most of the alternate systems, which are also called the traditional systems of medicine, they have something common. Most of them are basically plant ingredients, minerals, and in some of the systems at least, the parts of the animals are also used for treatment. So like Ayurveda, it believes that some minerals and plants, extracts of the plant procured in a traditional way, prepared in a traditional way, has a property of healing the humans. And it was found that there are Ayurveda says that there are three important elements in the human body: Kapham, Vatam, and Pittam. In North India or in Hindi, we will say Kaph, Vat, and Pitta. If you can find out these three elements, if you can manage these three elements, you can cure all the diseases, you can treat all the diseases. And it is claimed that many of these diseases can be cured with Ayurveda, for which we don't have, in modern medicine, there is no treatment. The fact is modern medicine is also incomplete. The reason why our modern medicine seems slightly different from Ayurveda and more close to the West is because this modern medicine started early in the West. And as West, the imperial invasion happened and the cultural invasion happened, all of us adopted the Western modern medicine. Had it not happened, probably in India also we would have developed a version of modern medicine of Ayurveda. So it is possible to do that. In Unani and Siddha, they also have the similar tradition. Siddha is from our neighboring state, Tamil Nadu, where the plant extracts are supposed to have property of healing the humans and at least providing the immunity, making the body stronger. Among all these traditional systems, homeopathy is the youngest. Homeopathy is younger to even modern medicine. The difference between modern medicine and homeopathy is where the modern medicine insists on all the disciplines of medicine have to be studied. In homeopathy, they have some very simple basic principles that some minerals are there. And if you use the dilution of the mineral in a particular amount, it is possible to treat a disease. So what they say that if you have an element which can cause illness, if you use that element in a very minute amount, it is somewhat like our understanding of the vaccination. If you use the mineral in a very minute amount, if you use that element in a very small amount, it is possible to treat that disease. So that is how homeopathy works. A lot of people practice homeopathy, but probably the reason is the simplicity of the concepts of homeopathy rather than anybody's real understanding of the principles. So as we have understood, we understand the modern medicine. I am able to comment on the modern medicine, but it doesn't mean that all the other alternate systems of medicine or traditional medicines of traditional systems of medicine are not good. They are probably good. They just did not get the chance to develop that much. And as Dr. Mohan said, that all the patients have the right to choose their own treatment. So with this, we come to the end of this session. Dr. Mohan, would you like to give some concluding remarks?
Thank you very much, Professor Alok. Personally, I consider this topic and the choice of me and Professor Alok doing this presentation together as a blessing from the heaven. You will be seeing both of us together in materia non-medica. On the occasion of the Institute Day, we conduct a quiz competition. Again, we both will be with you. And please remember, we have spoken with you. We have not spoken to you. By speaking with you, not only you learn, but we also learn with you. So I wish you all the very best and hope to see you on site in the college, in flesh and blood soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. I